The dressmaker's measuring tape snapped back with a sound like a whip crack, and Beatrice Brennan felt her cheeks burn hotter than the forge down at McGinty's smithy as Mrs. Henderson let out an exasperated sigh that seemed to fill every corner of the cramped shop in Central City, Colorado. "She weighs too much," Mrs. Henderson muttered, not quite under her breath, her thin fingers already reaching for a different measuring tape, as though the first one had somehow lied about the numbers. "I'll need to order extra fabric, and that means extra cost. The wedding dress will take twice as long to construct with all this additional material." Beatrice stood on the fitting platform in her chemise and petticoat, arms outstretched like a scarecrow, feeling every inch the spectacle Mrs. Henderson seemed determined to make her. It was March of 1876, and she had come to Central City with such hope just 3 months earlier, fleeing the judgmental whispers of Denver society after her mother's death. Her father, a banker, had arranged her engagement to Thomas Whitmore, a mine owner who needed a respectable wife to improve his social standing. Beatrice had agreed because she had nowhere else to go and no other prospects, despite never feeling anything resembling affection for the man. "Perhaps we should simplify the design," Beatrice offered quietly, her voice barely carrying over the sound of wagons rumbling past on Main Street below. "Something less elaborate would suit me fine." "Nonsense. Mr. Whitmore specifically requested the latest fashion from the East. He wants his bride to look prosperous." Mrs. Henderson circled Beatrice like a vulture, making disapproving noises with each measurement she took, though I cannot imagine why he chose someone so substantial. Men of his standing usually prefer more delicate women. The words stung worse than any wasp, and Beatrice blinked back the moisture threatening to gather in her eyes. She had heard variations of this her entire life. Her mother had been petite and lovely, and Beatrice had inherited her father's sturdy German build instead, tall and full-figured with strong shoulders and generous curves that no amount of tight lacing could diminish. She had learned to move through the world, making herself as small as possible, apologizing for taking up space, always aware that her body was somehow wrong by the standards of fashionable society. "I should have the dress ready in 6 weeks if the fabric arrives on time," Mrs. Henderson continued, jotting down notes in her ledger. "You may dress now. Try not to gain any more weight before the wedding, or I will have to start over entirely." Beatrice climbed down from the platform, her legs unsteady, and retreated behind the changing screen. She pulled on her day dress of simple brown calico, fastening the buttons with trembling fingers. Through the shop window, she could see the snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains rising above the town's wooden buildings and mine scaffolding. Central City sat at over 8,000 feet elevation, clinging to the mountainside in a maze of steep streets and precarious structures. The town had boomed after gold discoveries in the late 1850s, and though the easy placer gold was long gone, the hard rock mines still produced enough wealth to keep the settlement thriving. She emerged from behind the screen, paid Mrs. Henderson's deposit from her small purse, and escaped onto the street with relief. The afternoon sun was bright but provided little warmth against the mountain air's bite. Beatrice pulled her shawl tighter and began walking toward her boarding house on Eureka Street, her boots navigating the muddy ruts left by melting snow. Central City was built into a gulch, with buildings stacked up the steep hillsides like a child's blocks. The main thoroughfare bustled with afternoon activity, miners coming off shift, freight wagons hauling supplies, women hurrying between shops with baskets over their arms. The sound of a piano drifted from one of the saloons, mixing with the rhythmic pounding of stamp mills processing ore. Beatrice was so lost in her miserable thoughts that she didn't notice the commotion ahead until she nearly walked into it. A crowd had gathered in front of Feldman's General Store, and angry voices rose above the usual street noise. "I don't care if you trapped all winter," a man was shouting. "These pelts are second rate, and I will not pay premium prices for inferior goods." "Those are prime beaver and the finest mink you will see this season," came a deeper voice, calm but with an edge like a blade sliding from its sheath. "And you know it, Feldman." Beatrice edged closer, curiosity overcoming her desire to reach the solitude of her room. The crowd parted slightly, and she caught her first glimpse of the man arguing with the shopkeeper. He stood at least 6 feet 4 inches tall, a giant of a man with shoulders that seemed to span half the storefront. He wore buckskin trousers and a heavy coat made of what looked like bearskin, and his dark hair fell past his shoulders, held back from his face by a leather cord. His jaw was covered in several weeks' worth of beard, and his skin was weathered brown from sun and wind. His hands, resting on a stack of beaver pelts, were enormous, scarred, and capable-looking. Everything about him spoke of the high country, of the wild places above the tree line where few men ventured. Beatrice had heard talk of mountain men, trappers who spent months alone in the wilderness, but she had never seen one up close. They were becoming rare as the fur trade declined, relics of an earlier era. "I will give you half what you are asking, Fisher, and not a penny more," Feldman said, crossing his arms. He was a small, wiry man who looked even more diminutive next to the mountain man. "Take it or leave it." The mountain man, Fisher, gathered up his pelts with movements that were surprisingly graceful for someone so large. "I will leave it and take my business to Denver. There are honest merchants there who recognize quality." "Denver's 40 miles away," Feldman sneered. "You think you'll get a better price after hauling all that weight over the mountains? The freight costs alone will eat any extra profit." "Then I will wear every pelt as a coat before I let you cheat me," Fisher replied. He hoisted the enormous bundle of furs onto his shoulder as though it weighed no more than a blanket, and Beatrice marveled at the casual display of strength. The muscles in his arms and shoulders bunched visibly even through his coat. He turned to leave, and the crowd parted hastily. As he strode past Beatrice, his eyes met hers for just a moment. They were gray-blue, like mountain ice, startling in his tanned face. Then he was past, his long legs carrying him down the street toward where a massive roan horse stood tied to a hitching post. "Fool mountain man," Feldman muttered. "They are all half savage and twice as stubborn." The crowd dispersed, returning to their business. Beatrice stood motionless for a moment longer, watching as the mountain man secured his pelts to his horse with practiced efficiency. There had been something in his eyes during that brief moment of contact, a recognition perhaps, or maybe simple curiosity. She felt oddly unsettled, as though the brief encounter had shifted something in her world. Shaking off the strange feeling, she continued toward her boarding house. Mrs. Patterson, the landlady, was sweeping the front steps when Beatrice arrived. "How did the fitting go, dear?" Mrs. Patterson asked. She was one of the few people in Central City who treated Beatrice with genuine kindness. "Well enough," Beatrice lied, not wanting to repeat Mrs. Henderson's cruel words. "The dress should be ready in 6 weeks. "Just in time for the wedding, then." Mrs. Patterson paused in her sweeping. "Are you happy, Beatrice? You never speak of your intended with any warmth." Beatrice hesitated on the threshold. "Mr. Whitmore is a respectable man. I'm fortunate he was willing to take me." "Willing to take you?" Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose. "Child, you speak as though you are damaged goods. You are a lovely young woman with a good heart and a fine education. Any man should count himself lucky to win your hand." "You are very kind," Beatrice said softly, "but we both know that women like me cannot afford to be particular. I am 22 years old, plain and too large. Mr. Whitmore offers security and position. That is enough." She escaped to her room before Mrs. Patterson could argue further. The space was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the street. Beatrice sat on the bed and stared at her hands, work roughened despite her attempts to keep them soft with lanolin cream. Thomas Whitmore had proposed 3 weeks after her arrival in Central City. He was 41 years old, calculating and ambitious. He had made it clear that he wanted a wife who would manage his household, entertain his business associates, and ask no questions about how he spent his time. In return, she would have a home and security. It was a practical arrangement, nothing more. Beatrice had accepted because the alternative was becoming a burden to distant relatives, or finding work as a teacher or seamstress, struggling to survive on meager wages. Her father had left debts when he died 2 years earlier, and her mother's illness had consumed what little remained. She had no inheritance, no prospects, and no illusions about her position in the world. But sometimes, in quiet moments like this, she allowed herself to imagine something different. A marriage built on genuine affection, a man who looked at her with warmth instead of calculation, a life where she was valued for more than her ability to perform domestic duties and enhance someone's social standing. Foolish dreams, she told herself firmly. She was too old and too practical for such fantasies. The next morning, Beatrice walked to the small schoolhouse on the edge of town where she helped teach reading to minors' children 3 days a week. It was volunteer work, but it gave her purpose and kept her from dwelling too much on her upcoming marriage. The children ranged from 5 to 12 years old, a rowdy mix of boys and girls whose parents wanted them to have chances they had never had. She was reading aloud from a primer when the door opened and a man stepped inside, so tall he had to duck beneath the frame. Beatrice's words trailed off as she recognized the mountain man from the previous day. He looked even larger indoors, his presence seeming to fill the small schoolhouse. The children turned to stare, and young Tommy McCarthy gasped audibly. The mountain man's expression remained impassive as his gaze swept the room and landed on Beatrice. "Pardon the interruption, madam," he said. His voice was deep and carried easily without him having to raise it. "I am looking for the postmaster. I was told I might find him here." "Mr. Jennings teaches the older children in the afternoon," Beatrice managed, finding her voice. "He should arrive within the hour. You are welcome to wait if you wish." The mountain man nodded, but instead of leaving, he stepped fully inside and closed the door against the morning cold. "I will wait outside so as not to disturb your lesson." "You are welcome to wait here where it is warmer," Beatrice offered, though she felt suddenly conscious of her appearance, her simple dress and pinned-up hair. "The children are just learning about the Oregon Trail. Perhaps you could tell them something of wilderness travel. It would be more interesting than my reading from this book." She had no idea what possessed her to make such an offer. It was unlike her to be so forward, but something about the mountain man's calm presence made her bold. He considered this, then moved to the side of the room where he could lean against the wall. The wood creaked slightly under his weight. "What would you like to know?" "Everything," Tommy burst out, earning a reproving look from Beatrice. "Raise your hand if you wish to speak, Thomas," she reminded him gently. "Mr. Fisher, Malachi Fisher." He pronounced it Malachi, 3 distinct syllables. "Mr. Fisher has kindly agreed to share some of his knowledge with us," Beatrice continued. "Who can tell me why trappers and mountain men go into the wilderness?" Hands shot up, and for the next 40 minutes, Malachi Fisher answered questions about tracking animals, surviving winter storms, and navigating by the stars. He spoke plainly without embellishment, but his words painted vivid pictures of the high country, places where eagles nested and mountain lions hunted, where the snow fell so deep a man could walk over the tops of pine trees. Beatrice watched him as much as she listened. Despite his size and rough appearance, he was patient with the children, never dismissing even the silliest questions. When 8-year-old Sarah asked if he had ever fought a bear, he showed them a scar on his forearm where a grizzly had clawed him 5 years earlier. "I was checking my trap lines and got between a mother and her cubs," he explained. "My own fault for not paying better attention. She was just protecting her young, same as any mother would." "Did you kill her?" Tommy asked, eyes wide. "No. I fired my rifle into the air to scare her off, then got out of her territory as fast as I could move. She had more right to be there than I did." His eyes flicked to Beatrice. "I only kill what I need for food or pelts. The mountains are not a place for sport hunting." When Mr. Jennings arrived, Malachi thanked Beatrice for allowing him to wait inside, then followed the postmaster to his office in the back of the building. Beatrice tried to resume her lesson, but her thoughts kept drifting to the mountain man's quiet strength, the way he had treated the children with respect rather than condescension. She dismissed the class at noon and was gathering her materials when Malachi emerged from the postmaster's office, a small bundle of letters in his hand. He paused when he saw her. "Thank you for the hospitality, Miss Brennan, Beatrice Brennan." She clutched her books to her chest. "And you are welcome. The children enjoyed your stories very much. You are a good teacher, patient." He studied her for a moment. "You are new to Central City. I would remember seeing you before." "I arrived in December from Denver." She felt heat rising to her cheeks under his direct gaze. "How did you know I was new? You still have the look of the city about you, and you have not learned to walk like someone born to the mountains." At her confused expression, he added, "People here lean into the hills without thinking about it. You still stand straight, fighting the incline." It was such an odd thing to notice, yet somehow it made perfect sense. Beatrice found herself smiling slightly. "I suppose I do. Everything here is so steep, I feel as though I'm always climbing or descending." "You get used to it." He shifted his letters to his other hand. "Are you staying in Central City long?" "I'm engaged to be married in May, to Mr. Thomas Whitmore. I will be staying permanently." She did not know why she felt compelled to mention her engagement immediately, but it seemed important to establish. Something flickered across Malachi's face, too quick for her to read. "I see. Then I wish you happiness, Miss Brennan." He touched 2 fingers to his forehead in a kind of salute and left, ducking through the doorway and out into the bright mountain sunlight. Beatrice stood alone in the empty schoolhouse, feeling as though she had somehow lost something she had never actually possessed. Over the following week, she saw Malachi twice more in town. Once he was loading supplies onto his horse outside the general store, where he had apparently found someone willing to pay fairly for his pelts. The second time, he was in the post office when she came to mail a letter to a distant cousin in St. Louis. They exchanged polite nods, nothing more, but Beatrice found herself thinking about him at odd moments, wondering what it must be like to live in such solitude, to be so comfortable in wild places. Thomas called on her that Sunday, arriving in his carriage with his usual punctuality. He was a handsome man in a severe way, with pale eyes and carefully groomed side whiskers. He wore expensive suits ordered from San Francisco and carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I trust the dress fitting went well," he said as they sat in Mrs. Patterson's parlor, the required 2 feet of space between them on the settee. "Mrs. Henderson tells me there were some complications." "Nothing that cannot be resolved," Beatrice said carefully, not wanting to repeat the dressmaker's humiliating comments. "She suggested you might benefit from a more restricted diet in the weeks before the wedding." Thomas's tone was matter-of-fact, as though discussing a business transaction. "I would prefer my bride to present as fashionably as possible." Beatrice's hands clenched in her lap. "I will try to meet your expectations." "See that you do." He pulled out his pocket watch, consulted it, and stood. "I have a meeting with investors this afternoon. I will call on you again next Sunday." He left without any attempt at affection, no kiss on her hand or tender word. Beatrice sat in the empty parlor, feeling hollow. That evening, Mrs. Patterson brought tea to Beatrice's room, something she only did when she sensed her boarder needed company. "I thank you," Beatrice said, accepting the cup gratefully. "That man has all the warmth of a fish," Mrs. Patterson said bluntly, settling into the room's only chair, "and about as much romance in him." "He is practical," Beatrice defended weakly. "Not everyone believes in romantic love." "More is the pity." Mrs. Patterson sipped her tea. "My late husband was no poet, but he looked at me every day like I hung the moon, even after 30 years of marriage and 6 children. That is what you deserve, Beatrice, not some cold-hearted businessman who wants a housekeeper he can parade about." "That's all I am likely to get," Beatrice said quietly. "You are kind to wish better for me, but I know my limitations." "Limitations?" Mrs. Patterson set down her cup with enough force to make the saucer rattle. "Child, the only thing limiting you is what you believe about yourself. You have been told lies so long you think they are truth." Before Beatrice could respond, there was a commotion from downstairs. Raised voices, heavy footsteps. Then Mrs. Patterson's eldest son, James, appeared in the doorway, his face flushed with excitement. "Mother, you need to come quick. There has been an accident at the Lucky Strike mine. They are bringing injured men into town, and Doc Chambers needs every pair of hands he can get." Both women were on their feet immediately. Central City had no proper hospital, just Doc Chambers' office and a few rooms above it where serious cases could be monitored. Mining accidents were a constant danger in the hard rock mines surrounding the town. They hurried through the dark streets toward the doctor's office. A crowd had already gathered, and the scene was chaos. Miners covered in rock dust and blood, some walking, others being carried on makeshift stretchers. The acrid smell of dynamite smoke hung in the air. "Cave in," someone said. The whole north tunnel collapsed. At least 15 men were inside. Doc Chambers, a gray-haired man in his 60s, was triaging injuries by lamplight. "Mrs. Patterson, thank God. I need you helping with bandaging. Miss Brennan, can you handle boiling instruments and fetching supplies?" "Yes, of course," Beatrice said, though her stomach churned at the sight of so much blood. She spent the next several hours in a blur of activity, following Doc Chambers' instructions, trying not to think too hard about the terrible injuries she witnessed. Men with broken bones, crushing injuries, one poor soul who had been partly buried and was struggling to breathe. The doctor worked with calm efficiency, but even Beatrice could tell some of these men would not survive the night. She was in the back room sterilizing instruments when she heard a familiar deep voice in the front office. "I have 2 more from the mine. Found them in a side passage that got cut off." "Fisher, you are a godsend," Doc Chambers said. "Bring them through." Beatrice emerged to see Malachi Fisher carrying a man in his arms as easily as one might carry a child. Another injured miner leaned heavily against his side, Malachi's arms supporting most of his weight. Both rescued men were in poor shape, but alive. "Set them there and there," Doc Chambers directed, pointing to makeshift beds along the wall. "Miss Brennan, I need water and clean cloth immediately." As Beatrice hurried to comply, she was aware of Malachi's presence in the crowded room. He moved with the same quiet efficiency she had observed before, helping to settle the injured men, speaking calmly to keep them from panicking. When one man cried out in pain, Malachi gripped his hand and held it firmly until the worst passed. "How did you get them out?" Doc Chambers asked as he examined the first man. "I heard that whole section was sealed off." "I went in through an old ventilation shaft that most people have forgotten about," Malachi replied. "Could not fit much equipment through it, but a man alone could squeeze past. Heard them calling for help and followed the sound." "You went into an unstable mine alone?" Beatrice could not keep the shock from her voice. That was incredibly dangerous. Malachi's ice-blue eyes found hers across the room. Seemed necessary at the time. Over the next hour, Doc Chambers and his helpers stabilized the worst injuries. The death toll from the cave-in stood at 4, with another dozen men injured to varying degrees. It could have been much worse, and everyone knew it. Beatrice was washing blood from her hands in a basin when Malachi appeared beside her. Up close, she could see rock dust coating his hair and clothes and a fresh scratch on his cheek. "You did good work tonight," he said quietly. "Not everyone can keep calm around so much suffering." "I feel rather useless, honestly," Beatrice admitted. "Doc Chambers and Mrs. Patterson are the ones with real skill. I just followed orders." "Following orders in a crisis is a skill in itself. Most people freeze or panic." He accepted the towel she handed him, wiping the dust from his face. "You have steady hands and a steady head. That matters." The praise, simple and sincere, affected her more than any flowery compliment ever had. She realized she was staring and quickly looked away. "Were you injured at all? That ventilation shaft sounds treacherous." "Nothing serious, few scrapes and bruises." He paused, then added, "I should get back to my camp. Just wanted to make sure the men I found would be all right." "They are alive because of you," Beatrice said. "That takes courage. Or stupidity." But there was the faintest hint of humor in his tone. Hard to tell the difference sometimes. He left before she could respond, disappearing into the night. Beatrice found herself smiling despite the evening's horror, warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the overheated room. The days blended together as March gave way to April. Central City bloomed with the arrival of spring, wildflowers pushing up through the retreating snow, and the creeks running high with meltwater. Beatrice continued her teaching, attended fittings for her increasingly despised wedding dress, and endured Thomas's weekly visits with growing dread. She did not see Malachi again for nearly 3 weeks. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, she was leaving the schoolhouse when she spotted him examining horses at the livery stable. He had trimmed his beard and looked slightly more civilized, though no less imposing. Their eyes met across the street, and after a moment's hesitation, he crossed to her. "Miss Brennan." He touched his hat brim. "How are you?" "Well, thank you. And you?" The formal exchange seemed absurd given how they had worked side by side during the mining disaster. "Well enough." He glanced at the schoolhouse. "The children speak highly of you. Tommy McCarthy told me you were teaching him to read properly. His father is grateful. Tommy is a bright boy when he applies himself." Beatrice shifted her books to her other arm. "Are you staying in town for a while?" "A few days. Need to sell some supplies and stock up for summer trapping." He hesitated, then said, "I was about to get dinner at the restaurant. Would you care to join me? As thanks for your kindness to the miners." Beatrice's heart gave an unexpected leap. That is very kind, but I'm not sure it would be proper. I am engaged." "A meal between friends, nothing more," Malachi said evenly. "But I understand if appearances matter. No offense taken." He started to turn away, and Beatrice heard herself say, "Wait." When he looked back, she continued quickly before she could lose her nerve. "I would be happy to join you. You are right. There's no impropriety in two friends sharing a meal." Something that might have been pleasure flickered in his gray-blue eyes. "The restaurant, then. Their beef stew is tolerable." They walked together toward the restaurant, and Beatrice was hyper-aware of him beside her, towering over her despite her own considerable height. People watched them pass with obvious curiosity, the respectable schoolteacher and the rough mountain man. She could imagine the gossip already spreading, but for once she did not care. The restaurant was modest but clean, run by a German couple who served hearty food at reasonable prices. Malachi held her chair, a courtly gesture that seemed incongruous with his frontier appearance, and they both ordered the stew. "How long have you been trapping?" Beatrice asked when the food arrived. The stew was indeed good, thick with vegetables and tender meat. "Near about 15 years, since I was 19. He ate with neat economical movements. My father was a fur trader, worked the Missouri River country. I learned the trade from him." "Do you ever get lonely, spending so much time alone in the wilderness?" Malachi considered this as he chewed. "Sometimes. But the mountains have their own company if you know how to listen, and I prefer honest solitude to dishonest companionship." "That is a rather cynical view of humanity," Beatrice observed. "Realistic, maybe. Most folks wear masks pretending to be something they are not." His eyes met hers directly. "You do not do that, I have noticed. You are honest about who you are." Beatrice almost laughed. "I'm not sure that is a virtue. Perhaps I would do better if I knew how to pretend." "Why would you want to be anyone other than yourself?" The question, asked so simply, made her throat tighten. "Because who I am is not enough. I am too tall, too heavy, too plain, too everything that women are not supposed to be." "Says who?" Malachi set down his spoon. "The same people who think a man is only worth what is in his bank account? The ones who value appearances over character?" "The whole world, it seems," Beatrice said quietly. "Then the whole world is a fool." The certainty in his voice was almost startling. "You are strong, intelligent, and kind. You have courage, witnessed it myself during the mine disaster, and you are far from plain." Beatrice stared at him, unable to speak. No one had ever said such things to her, certainly not with such conviction. "I apologize if I have overstepped," Malachi said, apparently taking her silence for offense. "I only meant that you should not accept other people's judgments of your worth." "No, Beatrice swallowed hard. "I am not offended, only surprised. You barely know me. I know what I have observed. That is enough." He returned to his stew as though he had not just shaken the foundations of her world. They talked for another hour, the conversation flowing more easily than Beatrice had experienced with anyone in months. Malachi told her about the changing seasons in the high country, the way whole meadows would carpet themselves in wildflowers come summer. She told him about growing up in Denver, her love of books, her mother's long illness. When they finally left the restaurant, the sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Malachi walked her back to the boarding house, his presence a solid comfort in the gathering darkness. "Thank you for the meal and the conversation," Beatrice said at the front steps. "I enjoyed it very much." "As did I." Malachi looked like he wanted to say more, then checked himself. "I wish you well, Miss Brennan, in your marriage and everything else." There was something in his tone, a finality that made Beatrice's chest ache. "Will you be leaving Central City soon?" "Day after tomorrow. The beaver are starting to move to higher elevations. Best time for spring trapping." He touched his hat. "Good night." She watched him walk away into the twilight, his long stride carrying him quickly out of sight. Inside, Mrs. Patterson was waiting with knowing eyes. "That's a good man," the landlady said without preamble, "and he looks at you like you matter." "We are just friends," Beatrice protested weakly. "If you believe that, you are lying to yourself." Mrs. Patterson shook her head. "But I suppose you have made your choice. Just remember, it is not too late to unmake it." Beatrice went to her room and lay awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling, her mind churning with thoughts she knew she should not be having. The next day brought an unexpected invitation. Thomas arrived at the boarding house in mid-morning. informing Beatrice that they were attending a social gathering at the home of one of his business associates. "It is important that you make a good impression," he said, as his carriage climbed the steep hill toward one of Central City's finer neighborhoods. "Mr. Dalton is investing heavily in my latest mining venture. His wife has connections throughout Colorado society." "I will do my best," Beatrice assured him, though she felt the familiar dread of social occasions where she would be judged and found wanting. The Dalton house was elaborate by Central City standards, a two-story structure with actual glass windows and painted trim. Inside, at least 20 guests milled about the parlor, drinking punch and making polite conversation. Beatrice immediately felt out of place in her simple afternoon dress, surrounded by women in elaborate gowns with the latest fashions from the East. Thomas introduced her to Mr. and Mrs. Dalton, a wealthy couple in their 50s, then immediately abandoned her to discuss business with the men. Beatrice found herself standing alone near the refreshment table, smiling politely at people who looked through her as though she were furniture. "You are Thomas Whitmore's fiancée," a voice said. Beatrice turned to find a pretty blonde woman regarding her with undisguised curiosity. "I am Judith Harrington. My husband owns the Empire Mine." "Beatrice Brennan, pleased to meet you. I understand you came from Denver." Judith's eyes traveled over Beatrice's figure with the practiced assessment of someone skilled in finding flaws. "How brave of you to relocate to such a rough town." "Central City has been very welcoming," Beatrice said carefully. "Of course," Judith's smile did not reach her eyes. "Though I confess I'm surprised by Thomas's choice. He was engaged briefly last year to Melissa Simmons. Absolutely lovely girl, but she broke it off. Apparently she found him too cold. But then, one cannot be too particular when options are limited." The jab was clear, and Beatrice felt her face heat. Before she could formulate a response, another woman joined them, this one older and imperious-looking. "Judith, dear, are you monopolizing the bride-to-be?" The newcomer looked Beatrice up and down. "My dear girl, you must let me give you the name of my dressmaker in Denver. Mrs. Henderson is competent enough for simple garments, but for a wedding dress, you need someone with real skill, especially when there are challenges to work with." The implication was crystal clear. Beatrice murmured something noncommittal, her hands clenched at her sides. Around her, the polite conversation continued, but she could feel eyes on her, assessing, judging, finding her lacking. Thomas appeared at her elbow an hour later. "We are leaving. You barely spoke to anyone. I expected you to make more effort." "I tried," Beatrice said quietly as they climbed into the carriage. "Not hard enough, apparently. Mrs. Dalton commented that you seemed standoffish." His tone was cold. "I need a wife who can navigate social situations with grace, Beatrice. If you cannot manage that, you will be a liability rather than an asset." She sat in miserable silence for the rest of the ride, Thomas's words echoing in her mind. When he deposited her at the boarding house without even walking her to the door, she felt numb. Mrs. Patterson took one look at her face and immediately put the kettle on. What happened? The whole story poured out, the cruel comments, Thomas's criticism, her own inadequacy. Mrs. Patterson listened with growing anger. "That man is not worthy of you," she said firmly when Beatrice finished, "and those society vultures are not worth your tears. You have more character in your little finger than the lot of them combined." "But they are right," Beatrice said bleakly. "I am not suited to be Thomas's wife. I will embarrass him at every turn." "Then do not marry him." Mrs. Patterson gripped her hands. "It is not too late, Beatrice. You can still choose a different path." "And do what?" "I have no money, no family, nowhere to go. At least as Thomas's wife I will have security." "You will have a prison," Mrs. Patterson countered. "Is that truly better than freedom, even if freedom comes with uncertainty?" Beatrice had no answer to that. She went to bed that night feeling more trapped than ever, her wedding 6 weeks away, and her future set in stone. Morning brought an unexpected visitor. Beatrice was helping Mrs. Patterson with laundry when young Tommy McCarthy burst through the gate, his face flushed with excitement. "Miss Brennan, you have to come quick. There is a problem at the schoolhouse." Beatrice dried her hands and hurried after the boy, her heart pounding with worry. But when they arrived at the schoolhouse, there was no fire or disaster, just a crowd of townspeople gathered around something. "Tommy, what is this about?" she demanded. "Look, Miss Brennan." He pointed, and Beatrice pushed through the crowd to see. Someone had built raised garden beds along the sunny side of the schoolhouse, fresh lumber still golden new. The beds were filled with rich soil, and wooden markers indicated where different plants would be growing: carrots, beans, lettuce, herbs. "Who did this?" Beatrice asked in wonder. The mountain man," old Mr. Jenkins said. "Fisher. Saw him working before dawn. When I asked what he was doing, he said the children ought to learn about growing things, not just reading about them." "He brought the soil down from his camp in the high country," Mrs. Chen added. "Said it was better than what we have here in town. And he left seeds, too, all labeled and organized." Someone pressed a wooden box into Beatrice's hands. Inside were dozens of seed packets, each one labeled in careful, precise handwriting. Instructions for planting depths, watering needs, and expected harvest times. "He left at first light," Mr. Jenkins continued, heading back to his trap lines. "Said to tell you the children would enjoy the project." Beatrice stared at the garden beds, at the care and thought that had gone into them. Malachi had done this, spent money on lumber and seeds, labored before dawn to build something for children he barely knew, for her. The realization struck her like a physical blow. This was not just kindness. This was the action of a man who thought about what would bring her joy, who noticed that she loved teaching and wanted to give her tools to do it better. "Miss Brennan, can we start planting today?" Sarah asked, tugging on her sleeve. "Yes," Beatrice said, though her voice sounded far away to her own ears. "Yes, we can start today." They spent the morning planting seeds, the children delighted with the project. Beatrice moved through the motions mechanically, her thoughts entirely elsewhere. By noon, she had made a decision that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. She went directly from the schoolhouse to Thomas's office in the First National Bank building. His secretary tried to stop her, but Beatrice walked past without pausing, entering Thomas's private office unannounced. He looked up from his paperwork with clear irritation. "Beatrice, this is highly irregular." "I cannot marry you," she said without preamble. Her hands shook, but her voice was steady. "I am sorry for any inconvenience, but I cannot." Thomas set down his pen with deliberate care. "You are overwrought from yesterday. Sit down and calm yourself." "I am perfectly calm, and I'm not changing my mind." Beatrice twisted the small engagement ring off her finger and placed it on his desk. "You deserve a wife who can be what you need, and I am not that woman, nor do I wish to be." "This is absurd." Thomas stood, his face darkening. "We have an agreement. Invitations have been sent, arrangements made. You cannot simply back out." "I can and I am." Beatrice backed toward the door. "Again, I apologize for the inconvenience, but my decision is final." "You will regret this," Thomas said coldly. "You think you have options?" "You are damaged goods, Beatrice. No respectable man will want you after this." His words were meant to wound, and they did, but they also strengthened her resolve. "Perhaps you are right, but I would rather be alone and true to myself than married and miserable. Goodbye, Thomas." She left before he could respond, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. In the street outside, she paused, pressing a hand to her sternum, breathing deeply. She had just ruined herself. Thomas was well connected, and he would ensure everyone knew she had jilted him. She would be a scandal, unmarriageable, a cautionary tale. She had no money, no prospects, no plan. And yet, she felt lighter than she had in months. Mrs. Patterson was hanging linens when Beatrice returned to the boarding house. The older woman took one look at her face and asked, "What have you done?" "Something possibly very foolish." Beatrice sank onto the porch steps. "I broke my engagement." To her surprise, Mrs. Patterson laughed. "Thank God. I was beginning to think you would actually go through with marrying that cold fish." "You are not shocked?" "Shocked? Child, I'm relieved." Mrs. Patterson sat beside her. "Now, what are you going to do?" "I have absolutely no idea." Beatrice looked at her hands. "I need to find work, real work, something that pays. I cannot impose on your charity forever." "You have never been a charity case." Mrs. Patterson was firm about that. "But yes, you will need income. Let me think on it. I have friends in Denver, one who runs a school for girls. She has mentioned needing teachers." Denver. Beatrice's heart sank at the thought of leaving Central City, though she knew it made sense. There was nothing to keep her here. Nothing except a mountain man who had built her a garden and then vanished into the wilderness. News of the broken engagement spread through Central City faster than a wildfire. By evening, Beatrice could feel the weight of disapproving stares whenever she ventured outside. Mrs. Henderson sent a curt note demanding payment for the unfinished wedding dress. Two mothers withdrew their children from Beatrice's reading classes, declaring they would not have their young ones taught by such a scandalous woman. But there were kindnesses too. Doc Chambers stopped by with a basket of food, gruffly telling her that anyone with the courage to walk away from a bad situation had his respect. The Chen family brought fresh bread, and Mr. Jenkins offered to write her a letter of recommendation for teaching positions. "You are a good woman doing a brave thing," he said. "That takes more spine than most people have." Thomas, meanwhile, was telling everyone who would listen that Beatrice was mentally unstable, too emotional and irrational for the responsibilities of marriage. He made sure to mention her weight, her plainness, her unsuitability as a wife. Some people believed him, others did not. Beatrice endured it all with as much grace as she could muster, keeping her head high even as shame and doubt gnawed at her. Had she made a terrible mistake? Should she have swallowed her unhappiness for the sake of security? A week after she broke the engagement, Mrs. Patterson received a letter from her friend in Denver. The school needed a teacher to start in the fall, and the salary was enough for Beatrice to live modestly if she was careful. It was a lifeline, and Beatrice accepted it gratefully, though it meant leaving Central City in August. She tried not to think about why that made her heart ache, tried not to wonder where Malachi Fisher was, high in the mountains with his trap lines and his solitude. He probably had not given her a second thought, and she had no right to expect otherwise. May arrived with warm sunshine and the full glory of mountain spring. The garden at the schoolhouse flourished under the children's care, green shoots pushing up through the dark soil. Beatrice poured herself into teaching, determined to make her remaining months in Central City count for something. She was weeding the garden beds one afternoon, alone after the children had gone home, when a shadow fell across her. She looked up, and her breath caught. Malachi Fisher stood there, even more weathered than she remembered, his buckskin clothes showing hard use. But his gray-blue eyes were as startling as ever, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "You broke your engagement," he said without preamble. Beatrice slowly stood, brushing dirt from her hands. "News travels fast. I was in town selling pelts, heard talk." He studied her face. "Heard other things too, some not pleasant. People talk, I expected that." She tilted her chin up, refusing to show how much the gossip hurt. "They are saying cruel things, lies about your character." His jaw tightened visibly. "It is not right. It is the way of things." Beatrice tried to keep her voice light. "I made a choice, and there are consequences. I can bear it." "You should not have to bear it alone." Malachi took a step closer. "Why did you break the engagement, if I am not out of line asking?" Beatrice looked at the garden beds, at the evidence of his thoughtfulness, and decided on honesty. "Because I realized I would rather face an uncertain future alone than a certain future with someone who made me feel small. Because someone built me a garden, and that simple act of kindness showed me what consideration looks like. Because I wanted to be brave, even if only once." The silence stretched between them. When Beatrice finally found the courage to look at him again, the expression on Malachi's face stole her breath. "I built the garden because I could not stop thinking about you," he said quietly. "Because I would lie in my bedroll at night and picture you teaching those children, the patience in your voice, the way you smiled when they learned something new. Because I have trapped beaver in blizzards and tracked elk through avalanche country, but I have never been as afraid as I was walking away from you that night at the restaurant." "Malachi." Her voice came out as barely a whisper. "I am not a civilized man, Beatrice. I have spent more of my life in the wild than in towns. I am rough, uneducated beyond what my father taught me. I have nothing to offer you but a hard life in the mountains." He moved closer still, near enough that she could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes. "But I would spend every day trying to make you happy. I would never make you feel like you are too much or not enough, and I would count myself the luckiest man alive if you would consider me." Beatrice's eyes filled with tears. "You are offering me what exactly?" "Whatever you want. Friendship, if that's all you are comfortable with." Courtship, if you are willing. Marriage, if you could ever see yourself married to a mountain man. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently cupped her face in his enormous calloused hand. I'm offering you my heart, rough and untutored as it is. I'm leaving for Denver in August, she said, though what she wanted was to lean into his touch. I have a position teaching at a school there. Then I will come to Denver. I can trap the Front Range as easily as the Central Mountains. Wherever you are, that is where I want to be. His thumb brushed away a tear that had escaped. Unless you do not want that. If you say no, I will leave and not trouble you again. But I had to tell you. Had to make sure you knew you had another choice. Beatrice's practical mind listed all the reasons this was madness. They barely knew each other. He was offering her a life that would be difficult, far from society's comforts. There would be more scandal, more judgment. She would be the woman who jilted a wealthy mine owner for a primitive mountain man. But her heart, the part of her that had been silent and small for so long, was singing. I would like to be courted, she heard herself say, if you are truly certain. I come with nothing, Malachi. No dowry, no connections, no social graces. And I am not. You are perfect, he interrupted firmly. Strong and smart and kind and beautiful. Every part of you. Then he was pulling her into his arms, and Beatrice felt something release in her chest, some long-held tension finally letting go. She tucked her face against his shoulder and let herself cry, all the fear and hurt and loneliness of the past months pouring out. Malachi held her through it, one huge hand stroking her back, murmuring wordless comfort. When she finally pulled back, embarrassed by her loss of control, he produced a surprisingly clean handkerchief from his pocket. Sorry, she mumbled. I'm not usually so emotional. You have been through an ordeal. You are entitled. He waited while she dried her eyes. I need to make a supply run to Denver next week. Would you come with me? Properly chaperoned, of course. Mrs. Patterson could accompany us. You have already discussed this with Mrs. Patterson? Beatrice could not help smiling. I may have mentioned my intentions when I asked where to find you. He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. She was enthusiastic in her support, also threatened to shoot me if I hurt you. That sounds like her. Beatrice folded the handkerchief carefully. I would like to go to Denver with you, with proper chaperonage, as you said. Good. The relief on his face was touching. I should warn you, I am not skilled at courting. Never had much practice. Neither have I, Beatrice admitted. I suppose we shall learn together. Together, I like the sound of that. They stood in the afternoon sunlight, surrounded by the growing garden and the distant sound of the stamp mills, and Beatrice felt hope unfurling in her chest like one of the seedlings pushing toward the light. The trip to Denver took 2 days by wagon. Mrs. Patterson came along as promised, serving as chaperone and providing cheerful commentary on the scenery. Malachi handled the team with easy competence, his wagon loaded with furs to sell and supplies to purchase. Beatrice spent the journey learning about him. His father had died 5 years earlier, and his mother even earlier than that. He had a sister in St. Louis, married with children, whom he visited every few years. He had learned to read from his father, but had never attended formal school. He knew the mountains the way most men knew city streets, every peak and valley mapped in his mind. Do you ever get tired of the solitude? She asked as they made camp the first night. Mrs. Patterson had already retired to the tent Malachi had set up for the women, leaving them sitting by the fire under the starlit sky. Sometimes, he admitted, he was working a whetstone along the edge of his hunting knife, the rhythmic sound soothing. But I never liked crowds much. Too much noise, too many people wanting things. What made you decide to come back to town when you did? Beatrice wrapped her shawl tighter against the mountain chill. You could have stayed in the high country. Truthfully, he looked at her across the fire. I kept thinking about you, about whether you were happy, and I realized I needed to know, even if the answer was yes and it meant accepting you were not for me, could not stand not knowing. I was miserable, Beatrice said quietly. I think I knew even before I broke the engagement that I could not go through with it. You did not make me leave him, Malachi, but you did show me that kindness exists, and that gave me courage. You had courage already. You just needed a reason to use it. In Denver, Malachi was a revelation. Despite his rough appearance, he negotiated with furriers and merchants with shrewd intelligence, getting top dollar for his pelts. He treated Beatrice with careful courtesy in public, always maintaining proper distance, but his eyes followed her constantly, and small touches spoke volumes. A hand at her elbow to help her over rough ground, his coat offered without question when the temperature dropped. They visited the school where Beatrice would be teaching, and she met the head mistress, a formidable woman named Mrs. Clark, who approved of Beatrice immediately. "We need teachers with your credentials," Mrs. Clark said, "young women from good families who actually want to educate children rather than simply mark time until marriage." "I am very grateful for the opportunity," Beatrice said. When they returned to Central City, the gossip intensified. The jilted bride was being courted by a mountain man. The scandal was delicious, and tongues wagged furiously. Beatrice endured stares and whispered comments with as much dignity as she could muster. "Does it bother you?" she asked Malachi one evening as they sat on Mrs. Patterson's porch, Mrs. Patterson herself visible through the window, making a very obvious show of chaperoning. "The talk? No," he said it simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Let them talk. They are not living my life, and their opinions do not feed me or keep me warm. I wish I could be so unbothered. You are stronger than you know, Beatrice. You walked away from security to stay true to yourself. That takes more courage than most of those gossips will ever have." As the weeks passed, their courtship deepened. Malachi was unlike anyone Beatrice had ever known. He had no interest in society's rules beyond those required to maintain her reputation. He brought her small gifts from the mountains, smooth river stones, a hawk feather, wildflowers pressed between pages of his worn journal. He listened when she talked about books and teaching, asking thoughtful questions, genuinely interested in her thoughts, and he made her feel beautiful. Not through empty flattery, but through the way he looked at her, like she was a wonder he could not quite believe was real. When he finally kissed her for the first time, in Mrs. Patterson's garden with proper chaperonage nearby, Beatrice felt the earth shift beneath her feet. "I love you," he said against her lips, his hands gentle on her face. "I know it is soon, but I cannot keep silent. I love everything about you." "I love you too," she whispered back, and it was the truest thing she had ever said. They were married in June, a small ceremony in the Central City church with just a handful of friends in attendance. Mrs. Patterson cried happy tears, and Doc Chambers gave Beatrice away. The Chen family provided the wedding feast, and Mr. Jenkins played fiddle for dancing. Beatrice wore a simple dress of blue calico that Mrs. Henderson had grudgingly agreed to make after Malachi paid her double the asking price for the unfinished wedding dress, with instructions to burn it. When Thomas Whitmore heard about the wedding, he made one last attempt to smear Beatrice's reputation, suggesting she was unbalanced and the marriage would not last 6 months. "Let him talk," Malachi said when someone mentioned it. "In 6 months, I will be waking up next to the woman I love, and he will still be a bitter man. I know which future I prefer." Instead of going to Denver, Beatrice and Malachi decided to build a life together that honored both their needs. They found a compromise, a small cabin halfway between Central City and the high country, close enough to civilization that Beatrice could teach during the school year, remote enough that Malachi could trap and hunt with ease. Mrs. Patterson helped them purchase furnishings, and Malachi built much of what they needed with his own hands. The cabin was rough by society standards, but beautiful in its simplicity. One large room with a sleeping loft, a stone fireplace Malachi constructed himself, windows that looked out over mountains that seemed to stretch forever. They planted a bigger garden, and Malachi built Beatrice a reading nook where she could sit and watch the sunset. "It is perfect," she said on their wedding night, standing in the doorway and looking at the life they would build together. "You are perfect," Malachi corrected, pulling her close. "The cabin is just wood and stone. You are what makes it home." That night, in the privacy of their cabin, Malachi lifted her as though she weighed nothing at all, carrying her to the bed he had built with his own hands. Beatrice had spent years being told she was too much, too large, too heavy. In Malachi's arms, she felt delicate, treasured, exactly right. "I have you," he murmured against her hair, "and I'm never letting go." Their first year of marriage was an education in happiness. Malachi taught Beatrice to track animals, to read the weather in the shape of clouds, to move quietly through the forest. She taught him to read more fluently, introduced him to the poetry and literature she loved, showed him that learning could happen anywhere, not just in schoolrooms. They worked side by side through summer and fall, putting up food for winter, repairing the cabin, living in harmony with the land. When winter came and the snow piled deep, they were snug in their cabin, Malachi's trap lines bringing in enough income to supplement what Beatrice had saved from her teaching. In spring, Beatrice discovered she was pregnant. Malachi's joy was overwhelming and humbling. He became even more protective, though he respected her enough not to smother her. When she insisted on continuing to teach through the early months of pregnancy, he supported her, simply making sure she did not overwork herself. Their son was born in January 1877, during a snowstorm that left them isolated in the cabin for 3 days. Malachi delivered the baby himself, calm and steady despite never having done it before, guided by Beatrice's instructions and his own steady nerve. "He is perfect," Malachi breathed, cradling the tiny infant against his huge chest with infinite tenderness. Just like his mother. They named him Marcus, and he had his father's gray-blue eyes and his mother's dark hair. Beatrice had never known such fierce love existed, the overwhelming need to protect and nurture this small person they had created. When spring came and they brought Marcus to Central City for the first time, even the worst gossips had to admit the marriage seemed solid. Beatrice was radiant, Malachi was clearly devoted, and the baby was healthy and happy. Mrs. Patterson claimed grandmotherly rights immediately, and Doc Chambers gave Marcus a thorough examination, pronouncing him thriving. "You were right to follow your heart," Mrs. Patterson said, holding Marcus while Beatrice drank tea in her kitchen. "Look at this beautiful boy. Look at how happy you are." "I am happier than I ever imagined possible," Beatrice admitted. "Sometimes I wake up and cannot believe this is my life, that I get to wake up next to someone who loves me, who thinks I am perfect exactly as I am." "That is what love should be," Mrs. Patterson said firmly, "what it always should have been for you." Thomas Whitmore had remarried 6 months after Beatrice jilted him, to a young woman from a wealthy Eastern family. According to gossip, it was a cold marriage of convenience on both sides. Beatrice felt only pity for his new wife and relief for her own narrow escape. The years unfolded like the pages of a beloved book. Marcus grew strong and curious, learning to walk on sturdy legs, to climb before he could properly run, fearless in the way of children who knew they were loved. Malachi was an incredible father, patient and teaching, never too busy to answer questions or show his son how to track a deer or identify edible plants. Beatrice continued teaching, though she reduced her hours to spend more time with Marcus. She loved watching her husband and son together, the giant mountain man and the small boy who adored him, both of them usually covered in dirt from whatever adventure they had been on. When Marcus was 3, Beatrice gave birth to twin daughters, Clara and Catherine. Malachi cried when he held them for the first time, overwhelmed by the blessing of 3 healthy children. "How did I get so lucky?" he asked Beatrice, his voice rough with emotion. "We got lucky," she corrected, pulling him close. "Both of us." The cabin expanded as the family grew. Malachi built additional rooms, a bigger loft for the children, a separate space where Beatrice could teach the growing number of students who came to her for lessons. Their home became known as a place of learning and warmth, where children were welcome and curiosity was encouraged. Beatrice never returned to formal teaching in a schoolhouse, but she educated dozens of children over the years, often for free if families could not afford to pay. Malachi supported this completely, his trapping and occasional guide work for wealthy hunters bringing in enough income to support them comfortably. On their 10th anniversary, they made the long journey to St. Louis so Malachi could introduce Beatrice to his sister, Eleanor. The meeting was everything Beatrice could have hoped for, warm and welcoming, with Eleanor declaring Beatrice the best thing that ever happened to her brother. He was so alone, Eleanor confided, as they watched Malachi play with his nieces and nephews in the yard. "I worried about him constantly, living in those mountains with no one. Then I got his letter saying he had married, and I could not believe it. But now I see you together and it makes perfect sense. You balance each other." "He gave me courage to be myself," Beatrice said. "I will never stop being grateful for that." Marcus grew into a young man who loved the mountains as much as his father did, though he also inherited his mother's love of learning. The twins were fearless and clever, always into some adventure or another. The cabin rang with laughter and life, with the sounds of a family that knew love and security. When Beatrice turned 40, Malachi surprised her with a gift, a small printing press he had ordered from Denver. "You are always writing stories for the children," he explained. "I thought you might like to print them properly, share them with more people." Beatrice was speechless. The press represented months of his earnings, a significant investment. But more than that, it represented how deeply he knew her, how he paid attention to what brought her joy. She began writing and printing small books of stories and lessons for children, selling them for pennies to families throughout the mining camps and mountain towns. It was fulfilling work, creative and useful, and she loved it. The years brought changes, as years do. Central City's gold production declined, and the town shrank as miners moved on to new strikes. But their family remained, deeply rooted in the mountains they loved. Mrs. Patterson passed away peacefully in her sleep when Beatrice was 45, and they mourned the woman who had been such a champion of their love. Doc Chambers followed a few years later, and Beatrice and Malachi ensured he had a proper burial and headstone, remembering his kindness. The town changed, but their cabin remained, a constant in the shifting landscape. Marcus fell in love with a schoolteacher from Denver, bringing her to the cabin for his parents' approval. Watching her son with his chosen woman, seeing the way he looked at her with such devotion, Beatrice felt a circle completing. He had learned from watching his parents what love should look like, and he had chosen well. The twins both married eventually, Clara to a doctor and Catherine to a newspaper editor. Both stayed in Colorado, close enough to visit regularly, and both gave Beatrice and Malachi grandchildren who brought fresh joy and chaos into their lives. On their 30th anniversary, Beatrice and Malachi sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. They were both gray now, weathered by time and life, but Malachi could still lift her easily, and Beatrice still caught her breath when he smiled at her. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, leaning against his shoulder. "The life you gave up to be with me? The solitude you loved?" "Not for a single second." Malachi kissed the top of her head. "You gave me everything I did not know I needed. A family, a purpose beyond survival, a reason to wake up every morning with joy instead of just another day to get through." "You saved me," Beatrice said quietly. "I know people say that is too much weight to put on a person, but it is true. You showed me I was worth more than I believed. You gave me myself." "We saved each other," Malachi corrected. "Best decision I ever made was walking into that schoolhouse looking for the postmaster. Best thing that ever happened to me was you." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge, the same stars they had watched together for 3 decades. Inside the cabin, they could hear their youngest grandchildren playing under the supervision of Clara, who was visiting for the week. The sound of family, of life continuing, of love expanding outward in ever-widening circles. Beatrice thought back to that terrible day in Mrs. Henderson's shop, standing on the fitting platform while the dressmaker sighed over her weight, making her feel like a burden, like she was too much. She thought about Thomas Whitmore's cold calculation, the society women's cruel judgments, all the ways she had been told she was insufficient. And then she thought about Malachi lifting her on their wedding night like she weighed nothing, his strength effortless, his love absolute. The way he had looked at her that first time they had dinner together, like she was someone worth knowing. The way he still looked at her now, after 30 years, like she was precious. "What are you thinking about?" Malachi asked, sensing her mind had wandered. "About how the dressmaker told me I weighed too much," Beatrice said, "and how you lifted me like I weighed nothing. It seems like a lifetime ago." "It was a lifetime ago, a different life for both of us." Malachi's arm tightened around her shoulders. "And I would not change a moment of this one. Neither would I." The night deepened around them, the mountains standing sentinel as they had for millennia, witness to countless human stories. But this story, Beatrice thought, this story of a woman who was told she was too much and a man who showed her she was exactly enough, this story had a happy ending. Years continued to pass with the gentle rhythm of mountain seasons. Malachi's hair went fully silver, though his strength remained formidable well into his 60s. Beatrice's hands grew stiff with arthritis, making it harder to work the printing press. But she adapted, teaching her grandchildren to help her, turning the work into lessons about perseverance and creativity. Marcus took over more of the guiding work, taking wealthy clients into the high country while Malachi stayed closer to home. The twins visited often, bringing their children, filling the cabin with noise and laughter that Beatrice had once thought would never be part of her life. On quiet evenings, she and Malachi would still sit on their porch, watching the sunset together. Sometimes they talked for hours, sharing thoughts and memories. Other times they sat in the comfortable silence of two people who knew each other so completely that words were unnecessary. "Do you remember the first time you saw me?" Beatrice asked one evening. They were both in their 70s now, their lives rich with shared history. "Yeah, in town, arguing with the shopkeeper about furs," Malachi said immediately. "You were standing in the crowd, and when I walked past, you looked at me like I was a person, not a curiosity or a threat, just a person." "I remember thinking you were the biggest man I had ever seen," Beatrice admitted, "and then later, thinking you were the kindest. I remember you in that schoolhouse, patient with those children, your whole face lighting up when they understood something. I remember thinking I would give anything to have you look at me like that." "I did look at you like that," Beatrice said softly. "I do look at you like that." "I know." His hand found hers, fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of decades. "That is what made me the luckiest man alive." Their love story became something of a legend in the mountain communities. The society woman who chose a mountain man over a wealthy mine owner. The mountain man who built a garden for the woman he loved. Young couples would sometimes make the trek to their cabin, asking for advice on building a strong marriage. Beatrice and Malachi always welcomed them, sharing what they had learned. Love was choice, they would say. Not just the initial choice to commit, but the daily choice to put the other person first, to communicate honestly, to work through difficulties together. Love was respect and kindness and genuine partnership. "We are not perfect," Malachi would say. "We have argued and struggled and made mistakes. But we always remembered why we chose each other, and we never stopped choosing each other." "And," Beatrice would add with a smile, "we learned early that society's opinions matter far less than our own happiness. Other people will always have judgments. What matters is whether you can live authentically within your own partnership." Marcus took over the cabin when Beatrice and Malachi grew too old to manage it alone, but they remained in their home, surrounded by the mountains they loved and the family they had built. Great-grandchildren arrived, another generation to carry forward the legacy of love and courage. Malachi passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, Beatrice at his side, holding his hand. Even in death, his face was peaceful, content. Beatrice mourned deeply, the loss of her partner leaving a canyon of grief, but she was grateful for every day they had shared, for the life they had built together. She lived another 3 years, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who all adored her. She spent her final days in the cabin Malachi had built, looking out at the mountains that had witnessed their love story, holding the hands of her family. "Tell me again about how you met grandfather," her youngest great-granddaughter asked on one of those final days. So Beatrice told the story one more time. The dressmaker who sighed over her weight, the mountain man who lifted her like she weighed nothing, the courage to choose love over security, the life they built in the wilderness that was richer than any mansion. "And they lived happily ever after?" the little girl asked when the story finished. "Yes," Beatrice said, smiling. "We lived happily ever after. Not because life was always easy, but because we faced it together. That is what happily ever after really means, finding someone who makes you braver, kinder, and more yourself than you ever thought possible." When Beatrice passed, the entire community mourned. Her funeral was held in the Central City Church, now much smaller than it had been in the town's glory days, but still standing. They buried her next to Malachi in the small cemetery overlooking the mountains, their headstones simple but eloquent. Malachi Fisher, 1838-1916. Beloved husband, father, grandfather. He taught us that strength and gentleness can live in the same heart. Beatrice Brennan Fisher, 1854-1919. Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, teacher. She taught us that courage means being true to yourself. Their cabin became a home for Marcus's family, and then for his children's families, passing down through generations. The garden Malachi first built at the schoolhouse was long gone, but the one at their cabin thrived, tended by descendants who knew the story of how it all began. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sunset painted the mountains gold and crimson, those descendants would swear they could feel their presence, the mountain man and the woman he loved, still there in the wind and the mountains and the enduring stones of the cabin they had built together. Their love story became part of the land itself, a reminder that the best love stories are not about perfection or society's approval, but about two people who see each other truly, who choose each other completely, and who build a life together based on respect, partnership, and unwavering devotion. From a painful moment in a dressmaker's shop to a lifetime of joy in the mountains, Beatrice's journey was a testament to the transformative power of love and the courage it takes to claim your own happiness. She had been told she was too much, but Malachi showed her she was exactly enough, more than enough, everything. And in the end, that made all the difference.